prior to attempting to sway the minds of others, an unsettling reality must be confronted. Human conduct is dictated not by cold rationality, but by the currents of feeling, including apprehension, longing, and the fundamental requirement for security. The vast majority of individuals operate under the delusion that authority is gained through excessive speech, aggressive persuasion, or the relentless pursuit of being correct. They escalate their volume, reiterate their arguments, and exert constant pressure, yet the more they push, the more their actual authority diminishes, for true sway is surrendered the instant it is coerced. Genuine impact functions through an entirely different mechanism. Those who maintain tranquility during friction, who refuse to scramble for explanations, and who remain unmoved by emotional storms are the ones who command attention. Their power stems not from volume or dominance, but from an awareness of the hidden mechanics of the psyche that most people never pause to investigate. This narrative does not concern itself with deceitful tactics or treating individuals as mere tokens upon a board. Rather, it explores the underlying architecture of conduct, examining why people oppose, why they acquiesce, why they gravitate towards certainty, and why they challenge limits. True mastery of social dynamics is not a clever ruse but a refined expertise that originates with the governance of one's own self. Every connection is molded by unseen energies, such as pride, doubt, social standing, the dread of exclusion, and the drive for significance. The majority of disagreements are rarely about the literal subject of discussion, but rather about a perceived threat to the self, and most struggles for dominance occur well before the first sentence is uttered. When this realization takes hold, a fundamental shift occurs within you. You cease to respond with volatility, you stop viewing the actions of others as personal slights, and you abandon the need to triumph in debates, thereby discovering a profound sense of command. This command is not defined by crushing others, but by maintaining an unshakable foundation and seeing with absolute precision, while others are obscured by sudden whims. The most potent stance in any social exchange is one of composed perception, as people disclose far more through their actions than they ever could through verbalization. They telegraph their anxieties, their objectives, and their core principles to anyone who knows how to watch without casting blame. These chapters will sharpen your ability to detect these silent cues, not for the purpose of taking advantage of others, but to foster a deeper comprehension that naturally dissolves fear. Once human actions are understood, they no longer have the power to startle or unsettle you, and you remain unaffected by rudeness, trickery, or psychological coercion. You begin to identify recurring themes, predict outcomes, and select your words with intentionality, allowing your impact to expand organically from a place of existence and patience rather than from aggressive posturing. As we progress, you will discover why individuals probe the edges of rules, why a quiet moment often holds more gravity than a lecture, and how emotional restraint builds a natural aura of leadership. You will observe how these principles manifest in genuine dialogues, intimate bonds, and high-stakes environments, while also identifying the boundary where guidance becomes harmful. Influence that turns into exploitation inevitably destroys the foundation of belief, whereas authentic leadership preserves the independence of others, making them feel acknowledged and protected while you remain focused and internal. This path is not about developing an icy or distant personality. It is about becoming a pillar of strength. When you stop responding to every spark, the world takes note. When you cease the pursuit of validation, you find that esteem naturally follows. And when you prioritize transparency over sentiment, you gain the upper hand without the need for battle. This journey invites you to decelerate and analyze before you move, because the second you govern your own impulses, you are no longer a captive to the impulses of those around you. In our opening examination of why people act as they do, we find that every outward display, from benevolence to malice and from poise to doubt, springs from a singular origin. It is not derived from intellectual deduction, but from internal psychological tension. People prefer the myth of their own logical nature, convincing themselves that their choices are built upon evidence and structured philosophy, yet an honest view of human life reveals that most deeds are simply reflexes fueled by emotional protection. Dread is the silent architect of far more behavior than most care to acknowledge, including the fear of being discarded, the fear of losing one's rank, or the fear of being seen as trivial. These anxieties frequently mask themselves as wit, pride, withdrawal, or even excessive courtesy. When a person constantly speaks over you, it is seldom a sign of true strength, it is often a nervous attempt to maintain their footing. Human behavior is a form of balance where individuals migrate toward whatever grants them a sense of safety and importance, fleeing from anything that jeopardizes that equilibrium. This is the foundational law: no action is without a reason, and even the most self-destructive habits serve to shield the ego from a more terrifying truth. When you grasp this, the behavior of the world around you loses its sting. When an individual rejects your proposal, adopts a defensive stance, or pursues excessive validation, these actions are not personal strikes directed at you. Rather, they are efforts to steady their own internal equilibrium. The outward conduct is merely a manifestation of a deeper cause, which is almost always an emotional disturbance. Consequently, engaging in a direct confrontation with such behavior is seldom productive, for when you challenge someone's reaction, you are not engaging in a rational debate but are instead perceived as a threat to their very identity. Once the sense of self feels endangered, the capacity for reason evaporates, and the biological survival mechanisms take command, leading people to deny, shift blame, or withdraw entirely. Recognizing this reality provides you with significant leverage, not by overpowering others, but by mastering the environment. The most effective leaders do not clash with the surface-level behavior. They speak to the emotional requirement hidden beneath it, utilizing tools such as quiet reassurance, strategic silence, or a simple refusal to be drawn into the surrounding emotional turbulence. Furthermore, a vital engine of human action is the profound desire for internal consistency. People possess an inherent need to view themselves as stable, ethical, and capable. Thus, when the external world challenges this self-conception, the mind will often warp the facts to preserve its narrative. This explains why individuals frequently defend poor choices rather than making corrections, as acknowledging a mistake can feel like a total loss of personal authority. To avoid this, they rationalize their actions, point to external circumstances, or revise their memory of events, not out of inherent dishonesty, but because the ego values psychological security more than objective truth. In light of this, you must cease expecting people to act with logic when they are under strain, and stop demanding high levels of self-reflection from those who lack the capacity for it. By releasing these expectations, you eliminate disappointment. True impact is never achieved by trying to fix others. It is found by aligning your efforts with the actual flow of human nature rather than struggling against it. In addition to these factors, the pursuit of social standing remains a powerful motivator, as humans are exceptionally attuned to their rank within social, professional, and personal hierarchies. Even when individuals profess an indifference to such things, their body language, vocal shifts, and intensified reactions when they feel overlooked tell a different story. Because a threat to one's status triggers an instinctive defensive response, criticism is often perceived as a danger, while appreciation feels like a vital nutrient. Hence we find that subtle gestures, such as offering focused attention, showing genuine respect, and providing recognition, carry far more weight than any display of raw power. Understanding these status dynamics allows you to be precise in your interactions, ensuring you do not unintentionally wound another's pride or spark resistance without knowing the cause. You learn to select your phrasing and your physical presence with care, not for the sake of deception, but to bypass the friction of unnecessary ego battles. The final element to grasp is the immense power of ingrained habit, as a vast portion of human conduct consists of automatic, conditioned responses developed over long periods. Individuals often repeat these cycles because they are accustomed to them, not because they yield the best results, as the familiar offers a sense of safety, while change feels inherently perilous. This explains the tendency to remain in unhealthy situations or to resist innovative concepts even when their benefits are clear. Behavior in these instances is a repetitive loop rather than a conscious choice, and such loops cannot be broken by force. They can only be interrupted by heightened awareness. As you begin to comprehend the reasons behind these repetitive actions, you develop a profound patience, and through that patience, you gain a unique form of command. This is not the type of control that seeks to overwhelm others, but the type that maintains your own stability while the people around you are swept away by their impulses. Ultimately, this exploration is not about passing judgment on human nature, but about deciphering its complex code. Once you move past the frustration of questioning why people act poorly and begin to see the emotional gears turning beneath the surface, their actions become remarkably consistent. This predictability is not a cynical realization but a grounded one, providing you with the ultimate power, the power over your own internal state. From this moment on, you will no longer perceive behavior as a series of random or hostile events. Instead, you will view it as vital data. These are signals that point directly to the underlying fears, desires, habits, and identities of those you encounter. It is from this deep well of understanding that true, effortless influence finally begins to emerge. Moving into the second chapter, we explore the deceptive nature of dominance, often referred to as the illusion of control. The majority of individuals operate under the conviction that true mastery is derived from institutional authority, sheer force, or relentless persuasion. They assume that by refining their explanations, intensifying their pressure, or asserting their presence more aggressively, the environment will eventually submit to their will. While this approach may yield a fleeting appearance of success, a more complex process is unfolding beneath the surface. The more feverishly one attempts to regulate others, the more actual authority they silently forfeit. Control of this nature feels like power because it provides immediate, visible feedback. Individuals may obey, arguments may cease, and choices may be finalized. However, simple compliance is not the same as genuine influence. It is merely the result of psychological weight, and that weight invariably generates friction. Even when this opposition remains hidden, human beings are biologically programmed to safeguard their independence. The moment an individual perceives emotional or psychological coercion, their internal defenses activate. They might offer a polite nod while simultaneously disengaging their mind, agreeing outwardly while retreating into a state of internal defiance. This explains why mandatory control is unsustainable, as it fails to grasp the subtle nuance that defines true leadership. Furthermore, when you attempt to dictate outcomes through direct force, you inadvertently broadcast your own insecurities. Such behavior communicates a profound dread of the unknown, a fear of losing your footing, and an anxiety regarding how others perceive your status. People possess an intuitive ability to detect this vulnerability, even if they lack the words to describe it, and once it is sensed, your perceived strength begins to dissolve. In contrast, a state of tranquility achieves the opposite effect by signaling security and self-assurance. It informs those around you that you remain unthreatened by dissent, stagnation, or lack of clarity. Consequently, those who remain composed often find that influence gravitates toward them without their having to demand it, as others naturally orient themselves around that unwavering stability. The illusion of control deceives people into believing they must manage every moving part and every shifting opinion, yet it is impossible to govern another person's private thoughts. You can only shape the environment surrounding them, and once this reality is embraced, your entire methodology shifts. Rather than attempting to overwhelm an encounter, you focus on the governance of your own reactions. Instead of fighting resistance, you simply study it, and instead of filling a quiet moment with unnecessary justifications, you let the silence perform the heavy lifting. Indeed, silence is deeply unsettling for those who depend on external control, primarily because it strips away their conventional weapons. There is no pressure to push against, no arguments to refute, and no emotional handles to grab. That stillness has a way of unmasking hidden doubts. When you abandon the pursuit of control, others often disclose more than they originally planned. They become talkative, they start explaining their motives, and they rush to bridge the gap in the conversation. Through this process, they reveal their priorities, their anxieties, and their boundaries. This provides you with authentic leverage, which is born from transparency rather than coercion. Another reason forced control eventually collapses is the common mistake of confusing raw dominance with genuine authority. Dominance demands that others yield, whereas authority cultivates belief. Dominance breathes an atmosphere of stress, while authority establishes a sense of structure. One can feel the distinction immediately. A dominant personality requires constant external validation, frequently correcting others in public, interrupting mid-sentence, and reacting impulsively to any perceived slight. A person of true authority does none of these things, moving with deliberation, listening intently, and responding only when essential rather than out of reflex. True authority is never in a hurry, recognizing that impact flourishes when people feel honored rather than restricted. This transition does not imply a shift toward passivity, rather, it suggests a move toward strategic selectivity. You begin to choose precisely when to intervene, when to voice your thoughts, and when to simply allow a situation to manifest naturally. You cease the exhausting habit of micromanaging specific results and instead focus on guiding the overall trajectory. This illusion of control is also prevalent in how people manage their reputations. They over-explain their motives, defend themselves before an accusation is even made, and provide reasons for actions that require no apology. Such behaviors are rooted in the desperate fear of losing social favor, yet favor is a precarious foundation that can be pulled away at any moment. The instant others realize you are hungry for their approval, the balance of power shifts away from you. You reclaim your autonomy only when you no longer feel the need to curate every impression, when you can endure being misunderstood, when you can sit comfortably in the quiet, and when you can allow others the freedom to hold a mistaken opinion of you. This emotional autonomy proves deeply disconcerting to those who rely on psychological maneuvering or coercion, primarily because they can find no point of leverage. There is simply nothing for them to grasp, and thus, they are forced to adapt. Impact is most effective when it is perceived as entirely voluntary, occurring when individuals are convinced that they reached a conclusion through their own volition. Consequently, the most formidable leaders prioritize the art of inquiry over the delivery of mandates, guiding the focus of others rather than their specific actions. They recognize that true mastery is not found in compelling motion, but in fostering alignment, which occurs when people feel acknowledged rather than trapped. This section does not advocate for the abandonment of authority. Rather, it identifies its true residence, not in the act of crushing others or reacting to them, but in the maintenance of one's own composure. When you release the desperate need to govern others, you finally begin to govern yourself, and this transition alters every social equation. The individual who does not crave dominance is the very person others instinctively choose to follow, signaling the end of the deceptive pursuit of control and the birth of authentic influence. Progressing into the third chapter, we find that influence is fundamentally rooted in self-governance. Long before you attempt to sway an external audience, you are subjected to a more subtle and demanding trial, the ability to manage your own internal world. Many individuals forfeit their social standing well before they utter a single word, losing it through impulsive reflexes, a heightened volume, a hurried answer, a protective tone, or a visible wave of irritation. While these instances may seem trivial, they broadcast an underlying instability that systematically dissolves trust. It is important to clarify that self-regulation is not the act of suppressing one's feelings. Rather, it is the practice of acute awareness followed by intentional decision-making. When faced with a catalyst, be it insolence, a challenge, or a heavy silence, the physical form responds first, the pulse quickens, muscles constrict, and the mind begins to race. This is not a personal failure but a biological reality. However, the crisis emerges when you allow these involuntary responses to drive your outward conduct. Those who lack internal discipline become perilously predictable. Once their triggers are identified, others can manipulate them with ease, turning their lack of restraint into a significant vulnerability rather than a source of strength. Authentic authority is reserved for those capable of inhabiting the space between a stimulus and their subsequent response. That brief interval is where true power resides, providing the opportunity to determine whether to intervene or remain still, whether to connect or pull back, and whether to offer clarification or let the instance breathe. Most disputes intensify simply because one party could not endure that pause, seeking immediate psychological relief, validation, or a sense of command. Yet, such relief is ephemeral, whereas true impact is enduring. By mastering your reactions, you transmit a potent message. Your psychological state is not a hostage to the behavior of those around you. You are not easily unsettled, nor do you feel the compulsion to validate your existence. This steadfastness fundamentally shifts the atmosphere of any encounter, people begin to calibrate themselves to your frequency, selecting their words with greater care and slowing their pace. They listen not because you have coerced them, but because your internal gravity pulls them toward you. Furthermore, self-discipline serves as a guardian of intellectual clarity. In moments of high emotional tension, our perception begins to contract. We develop a form of selective hearing and interpret the actions of others as threats rather than mere data points. We overlook nuanced signals, and once this occurs, our choices cease to be strategic and become merely reactive. In contrast, a tranquil mind possesses a wider field of vision, detecting subtle shifts in vocal tone, recurring behavioral themes, and unspoken friction. This heightened state of awareness facilitates a response defined by precision rather than sheer force, and precision invariably commands more respect than raw intensity. Another pillar of self-regulation is the practice of restraint, the capacity to do less even when the ego screams for more. It is the discipline to remain quiet when you desire to explain, to wait when you wish to hurry, and to allow others to disclose their true nature without interruption. Though restraint may initially feel like a sign of weakness to the ego, true strength is often quiet. It is demonstrated by what you choose not to say and how you refuse to react. Those who have mastered this art rarely need to assert their dominance. Their boundaries are understood without being shouted, and their confidence requires no external applause. Conversely, the emotionally volatile struggle to hold on to authority because they are constantly leaking vital information and exposing their softest points, granting others leverage without ever intending to. The cultivation of internal discipline serves to seal the psychological vulnerabilities that otherwise invite interference. By establishing a steadfast inner atmosphere, you project a sense of equilibrium that others instinctively perceive, and when individuals feel this stability, their defenses diminish. In this state of relaxation, they become increasingly receptive, allowing the currents of influence to move without friction. Furthermore, rigorous self-governance acts as a shield against psychological maneuvering. Deceitful tactics rely almost entirely on the provocation of sentiment, be it remorse, apprehension, resentment, or a false sense of urgency. If your response is instantaneous, the maneuver succeeds. However, if you introduce a deliberate pause, the strategy collapses. The momentum of the other party vanishes, and the pressure evaporates. In these instances, your silence is not a sign of frailty but a resolute refusal, a refusal to be hurried, to be psychologically compromised, or to surrender your mental clarity. Over time, people recognize that emotional coercion is ineffective against you, and once that reputation is established, it is seldom challenged. Influence is the fruit of this unwavering consistency. It is not a single moment of poise, but a reliable pattern of behavior. When others come to expect that you will not be baited or provoked, your subsequent words carry immense gravity. It is vital to understand that this path does not require you to become detached or unfeeling. Rather, it demands that you become anchored, remaining deeply connected to the situation without being consumed by it, and engaging fully without losing the core of your being. Ultimately, the most impactful presence in any environment is not the one producing the most noise, but the one who maintains their foundation while others are adrift. Influence originates in this mastery of the self, viewed not as the suppression of emotion, but as its governance. Once you have truly mastered your own nature, the compulsion to dominate others simply fades away. Progressing to our fourth point of analysis, we examine the architecture of emotional sensitivities and human vulnerability. Every individual possesses psychological pressure points, not as a result of a character flaw, but as a byproduct of the human condition. These sensitivities, or triggers, represent the intersection of past history, lingering doubt, and unaddressed anxiety. When these points are stimulated, they bypass the higher functions of the brain and shift behavior into a reactive state of autopilot. Gaining an understanding of these sensitivities is not about the exploitation of others. It is about the recognition of recurring themes so that you are no longer startled, manipulated, or drawn into futile disputes. A trigger is never the external event itself, but rather the narrative the mind constructs about that event. This explains why two people can face identical circumstances yet respond in polar opposite ways. One remains unmoved while the other becomes combative or isolated. The disparity is found in internal perception, not in objective reality. The majority of these sensitivities can be categorized into several primary themes: the dread of exclusion, the perception of insolence, the fear of losing autonomy, and the pain of being overlooked. Feelings of rejection activate a primal fear of isolation. Consequently, a late response or a neutral tone may be interpreted as a total dismissal of one's worth. The resulting behavior often manifests as excessive justification or a sudden emotional retreat. Sensitivities regarding respect activate a need to safeguard one's social standing. When an individual feels publicly corrected or ignored, they may resort to sarcasm or aggression. In this context, what appears to be a display of confidence is actually a desperate attempt to avoid being diminished. Fears regarding the loss of authority activate deep-seated anxiety, leading to an urge to micromanage or rush decisions as a way to find relief from ambiguity. Finally, the sensation of being unseen triggers a feeling of internal void. When people feel their contributions are ignored, they may resort to drama or exaggeration to secure validation as a substitute for true connection. These behaviors are not calculated maneuvers. They are instinctive, protective reflexes. Once a sensitivity is triggered, the analytical mind retreats, the physical body tenses, and logical thought becomes irrelevant until a sense of safety is rebuilt. This is precisely why engaging in a rational debate with a person in this state is rarely successful. You are communicating with a defensive nervous system rather than a reasoning intellect. Impact in these high-stakes moments is achieved through regulation rather than superior logic. If you respond to their volatility with your own, the tension merely escalates as two defensive systems collide. Power invariably shifts to the individual who remains the least reactive. This is why the self-governance explored previously is so fundamental. Without it, the knowledge of triggers remains mere theory. With it, those triggers become valuable data. When someone reacts with disproportionate intensity, you must ask yourself what underlying fear is being disturbed, not to offer a public critique, but to orient your own response with strategic precision. Adopting this perspective effectively eliminates personal offense. You cease to view the conduct as a direct assault and begin to interpret it as a vital indicator. These indicators serve to guide your strategy. On occasion, that strategy may involve quiet reassurance, a composed acknowledgement that restores a sense of psychological security. In other instances, it may require distance, allowing the surge of feeling to dissipate without your engagement. Alternatively, it might necessitate firmness, a transparent boundary established without an ounce of hostility. The specific technique is secondary to the underlying tone, as emotional sensitivities respond to nonverbal cues rather than literal vocabulary. Your internal steadiness has the power to regulate the entire environment, de-escalating tension without the need for a single word of explanation. The most frequent error individuals commit is attempting to rectify these sensitivities in the heat of the moment. They offer explanations of their intent, defend their positions, or try to correct the other person's perception, which often exacerbates the issue. A mind under the influence of a trigger does not process reassurance as comfort. It perceives it as a further threat or a dismissal of its current reality. Intentionally applied silence often proves more effective, as it grants the nervous system the necessary room to breathe, removes the fuel from the fire, and allows the emotional wave to reach its peak and naturally recede. When individuals eventually regain their composure, they often recognize their reaction was excessive, but this realization only occurs if they were not humiliated or confronted during the process. Furthermore, a deep understanding of these psychological pressure points serves as a fortress against manipulation. Deceptive behavior depends on triggering a sense of immediate urgency, remorse, or dread. Phrases designed to pressure you into deciding instantly, or those that suggest your character is lacking if you do not comply, are specifically engineered to bypass your reflective faculties. By recognizing these triggers for what they are, you reclaim your power of choice, you decelerate, you pose clarifying questions, and you intentionally delay your response. The manipulation loses its momentum because its success is predicated on speed and unbridled emotion. This analysis is not an invitation to become alienated from human sentiment. Rather, it is about remaining firmly rooted within it. It is entirely possible to be empathetic without becoming reactive, and to be understanding without being pulled off balance. Human vulnerability is not a resource to be exploited, but a reality to be respected, starting with your own internal landscape. The more conscious you become of your own triggers, the less authority they hold over you. Consequently, the less reactive you are, the less others can dictate the trajectory of your life. While emotional sensitivities will always be part of the human experience, understanding them ensures they no longer dictate the final outcome, bringing you closer to a form of influence that is tranquil, ethical, and entirely unshakable. In the 5th chapter, we examine the profound efficacy of silence and the mastery of timing. There is a common misconception that influence is the result of saying the precise thing, finding the flawless argument, or the most persuasive explanation. In reality, impact is often generated by the wisdom of knowing when to remain quiet. Silence is inherently disconcerting because it strips away conventional defenses, unmasks true intentions, and creates a vacuum that forces self-awareness. This is precisely why a quiet moment feels so threatening to those who depend on external control or constant validation. Silence is not a void where power is missing, it is the active presence of restraint. When you speak with undue haste, you broadcast a sense of urgency. When you offer excessive justifications, you broadcast insecurity. And when you rush to answer, you voluntarily surrender your leverage. Timing is invariably more significant than the actual substance of your words, and silence is the most strategic timing mechanism at your disposal. Observe how people respond when a query is met with a pause. They scramble to fill the void, they elaborate, they offer clarifications, and they ultimately disclose far more than they originally intended. Silence invites a natural disclosure without the need for coercion. This phenomenon is not a product of deceit but a reflection of human nature. People are fundamentally uncomfortable with unresolved tension and naturally seek closure. When you refuse to provide that closure prematurely, they will often perform the psychological work themselves, providing you with insights far more valuable than forced compliance. Moreover, silence fundamentally alters the power balance within a dialogue. The individual who speaks less frequently commands greater authority, not through a lack of participation, but because they are not desperately trying to convince anyone of anything. They are instead observing, processing, and evaluating. Subconsciously, people attribute higher status to those who do not seem hungry for approval. Silence communicates that you are grounded and not frantic to be understood or accepted. Timing serves to amplify this effect. Even the most profound insights lose their impact when delivered at the wrong moment, whereas simple truths shared at the precise juncture can shift the entire direction of an interaction. Mastery of timing requires a high degree of patience, emotional regulation, and the capacity to inhabit uncertainty without rushing toward a resolution. This is where most people falter, mistakenly equating silence with frailty, or waiting with passivity. In reality, waiting is often the most potent action one can take. In the midst of conflict, silence prevents escalation. When emotions are surging, words are easily distorted. A deliberate pause allows the emotional charge to fade, creating the necessary space for clarity to return. Within the context of a negotiation, silence exerts a psychological weight that achieves its aims without the use of raw force. When you clearly articulate a stance and then cease speaking, the other party feels an internal obligation to provide a response, frequently disclosing their true priorities, their ultimate boundaries, and their points of unease. The more at ease you remain within that quietude, the more you govern the underlying rhythm of the exchange. This cadence is vital, as a rapid tempo typically favors the volatility of sentiment, whereas a deliberate, slower pace favors the application of logic. By decelerating the speed of the dialogue, you effectively shift the interaction onto your own terms, fostering an environment for reflection and dissolving the artificial sense of urgency that often fuels impulsive mistakes. Furthermore, silence serves as a protective barrier against the utterance of words that cannot be retracted. Verbalizations produced in the heat of emotion often inflict damage that far exceeds their original intent. Silence, therefore, functions as a buffer, granting you the necessary time to select your phrasing with intentionality rather than reflex. There is, however, an even more profound dimension to silence, its ability to unmask true intent. Those who maintain a constant stream of speech are frequently attempting to curate a specific perception of themselves, while those who can endure silence are generally more synchronized with their own internal world. They do not crave perpetual affirmation, as their identity is not anchored to the requirement of being heard. This internal alignment generates a palpable presence, a quality that is felt by others long before it is consciously understood. Such presence cannot be manufactured. It is the natural byproduct of inner equilibrium. When you embody this presence, others become more focused, the dialogue sharpens, and external distractions begin to dissolve. It is essential to distinguish, however, between intentional silence and passive withdrawal. Silence born of avoidance, fear, or hesitation does not generate influence, it merely creates ambiguity. Authentic silence is composed, rooted, and observant, the silence of an individual who is actively processing rather than hiding. You can discern the difference by observing the reactions of others. When silence is grounded, people tend to lean in toward you. When it is fearful, they tend to push away. The intersection of timing and silence produces a form of social precision. You speak only when it is truly consequential and act only when the moment is ripe, refusing to squander your energy on trivialities. Over time, your environment learns that when you do choose to speak, your contribution is of high value. This exploration does not suggest a surrender of authority, but rather a refinement of it, teaching you to prioritize the caliber of your words over their volume, and to respect the inherent strength of restraint. In a society that often prioritizes noise, the ability to remain quiet is a rare commodity, and what is rare is inherently powerful. By mastering the art of silence and the wisdom of timing, you cease the exhausting pursuit of influence, and instead allow it to gravitate toward you. Moving into the 6th chapter, we examine the art of analyzing conduct without the interference of judgment. A common fallacy is the belief that we understand others simply because we listen to their words. In reality, verbal communication is often the most deceptive layer of human interaction. People frequently distort the truth to safeguard themselves, exaggerate to bolster their importance, or soften the reality of a situation to bypass friction. Behavior, however, remains the most transparent indicator of truth. It is the tangible result of what occurs when intent meets the world. To interpret behavior with accuracy, one must first discard the lens of judgment, as personal bias and emotional labels distort what should be a neutral observation. The moment you categorize someone as manipulative, arrogant, or weak, you lose the ability to see them clearly. Reading behavior is not an exercise in character diagnosis. It is the practice of identifying recurring patterns. These patterns reveal consistency, and consistency reveals true motivation. When a person's verbal promises and physical actions are in alignment, belief is strengthened. However, when they consistently diverge, it is a signal to observe with curiosity rather than accusation. Behavior serves as a form of feedback, highlighting what an individual truly prizes, dreads, and prioritizes. The essential requirement here is emotional distance, not as a form of detachment, but as the ability to remain present without being emotionally swallowed by the situation. By observing without judgment, you create a vital space between the external stimulus and your own interpretation, and it is within that space that clarity is found. For example, if an individual habitually offers agreement but fails to execute their promises, do not rush to label them as deceptive or disrespectful. Instead, acknowledge the recurring theme and consider the underlying drivers. Perhaps it is a fear of conflict, a desire to be liked, or an inability to manage commitments. The specific answer is often less important than the data itself, as data informs your strategy while judgment only breeds resistance. Furthermore, it is a mistake to assume intent based on a single, isolated incident. Human conduct must be evaluated over a long period. While a single reactive moment under stress does not define an individual, a repeated pattern of reactions in similar circumstances reveals the underlying psychological structure. Understanding that structure is the key to true influence. Individual character is most vividly revealed during periods of strain, dissent, and ambiguity. It is not during moments of ease that the true self is displayed, but rather when the nervous system is fully engaged. Observe the results when expectations are left undefined, witness the reaction to a firm boundary, and note how a person treats those from whom they can gain nothing. These instances serve as apertures into their core principles. While physical cues, such as changes in posture, visual engagement, vocal tone, and the tempo of speech, broadcast internal states, these signs must be interpreted within their specific environment. For example, folded arms might indicate a defensive mindset, or they may simply be a reaction to a cold room. Interpretation devoid of context is merely a projection of one's own biases. This is why impartial perception is so vital. You accumulate data, identify recurring themes, and delay reaching a final conclusion until the patterns become undeniable. Analyzing conduct without the weight of judgment also serves as a defense against psychological coercion. Manipulation thrives on inciting a personal interpretation, convincing you that you are under attack or being disrespected to force an immediate response. When you transition from reaction to observation, the intended manipulation loses its impact. You cease to view behavior as a personal affront and instead see it as a contextual event. This shift is remarkably potent. Often, when you refuse to react emotionally, others will briefly intensify their behavior as they test their old tactics. When those methods fail to elicit the usual response, they are forced to either adapt their approach or expose their true motives. In this scenario, your composure acts as a reflection. Those with sincere intentions will respond with transparency, while those with hidden agendas will likely display frustration. Both results provide you with essential data. Impact expands through this heightened awareness. Once you grasp the mechanics of someone's behavior, there is no need for aggressive confrontation. You can instead adjust your boundaries, modify your proximity, and choose your level of engagement with surgical precision. Furthermore, this practice fosters self-reflection. You begin to identify your own recurring themes, noticing when you become protective, when you scramble for approval, or when you over-explain. While these realizations may be unsettling, they are vital. You cannot perceive the reality of others if you remain oblivious to your own internal landscape. As you sharpen this ability, your very presence undergoes a transformation. You speak less frequently, yet with greater purpose. You listen with a depth that notices subtleties others overlook. People intuitively sense this change, recognizing that you are neither easily deceived nor quick to cast blame. This duality fosters a unique form of esteem, where individuals become more transparent in your presence, not due to a demand for honesty, but because your stability creates an environment that invites it. This approach is not about becoming a cold analyst, it is about achieving a state of precision. Precision is the bedrock of genuine authority. By reading behavior without the lens of judgment, you gain profound insight without the friction of conflict, protecting your own energy and selecting your responses with deliberation. This allows you to navigate the complexities of human interaction with a clear mind and a quiet, unshakable authority, understanding people not through the labels you give them, but by witnessing them exactly as they are. In the 7th chapter, we distinguish between the pursuit of approval and the establishment of authority. A common error is the belief that being well-liked is synonymous with having influence. In an effort to maintain harmony, many individuals soften their language, ignore their own boundaries, and suppress their true selves. While this may appear successful on the surface, minimizing conflict and eliciting positive feedback, it quietly undermines one's internal standing. Approval is inherently conditional, whereas authority is rooted in the self. When your primary goal is to be liked, your behavior becomes inherently reactive. You are constantly monitoring the room and hesitating to voice necessary truths for fear of losing favor. Once approval becomes your primary currency, you are perpetually vulnerable because that currency can be revoked at any time. True authority, conversely, does not seek permission to exist. It emerges from an internal alignment with one's own values and the consistency of one's actions. While others may disagree with your stance, they will respect the clarity of your position. That clarity provides a sense of stability that ultimately builds lasting trust. The desperate need for external validation often takes root in early environments where safety and acceptance felt contingent upon performance. Over time, this reflex, saying the right thing to keep the peace, becomes an automated way of existing. However, A peace maintained through the erasure of one's own identity is incredibly fragile and requires exhaustive maintenance. The moment you eventually choose to assert yourself, you will likely face resistance from those who have grown accustomed to your compliance. This is why the search for approval eventually breeds a sense of being taken for granted. Authority avoids this cycle by establishing quiet boundaries from the outset, not through aggression, but through unwavering consistency. A person of authority does not feel the need to justify their boundaries. They simply live them. When you abandon the chase for validation, the nature of your interactions changes. People will inevitably test you, challenging your tone or questioning your choices, but this is often a process of calibration rather than hostility. They are seeking to understand where your limits lie. If you retreat, you may keep their approval, but you will lose their respect. If you remain steadfast and calm, that comfort is replaced by genuine esteem. Maintaining authority does not necessitate becoming inflexible or cold. Rather, true leadership is adaptable without being porous. It possesses the capacity to listen intently without surrendering its ultimate course, and it evaluates diverse perspectives without collapsing under the weight of others' opinions. Perhaps the most transparent indicator of authentic standing is the ability to cause disappointment without descending into panic. Those who are tethered to the need for validation perceive the disappointment of others as a personal crisis. They scramble to rectify the situation, offering endless justifications and excessive apologies. Such conduct broadcasts a profound sense of fear. In contrast, authority endures disappointment not through malice, but through composure. It recognizes that total agreement is an impossible standard and that consensus is not a prerequisite for mutual esteem. This endurance grants you immense leverage. When people realize that your convictions are not easily eroded by psychological pressure, they begin to communicate with greater transparency and negotiate with more sincerity. Consequently, the entire dynamic of the relationship achieves a new level of clarity. Authority also refines the way you verbalize your thoughts. You speak with greater economy and intention, avoiding desperate emotional pleas. You no longer feel the impulse to argue for your inherent value, allowing your consistent actions to serve as your primary advocate. Over time, this reliability becomes visible to everyone around you. People begin to place their trust in your choices, even when they find those choices challenging, because your authority is predictable in the most positive sense. It does not fluctuate based on your mood, your anxieties, or the whims of public favor. Approval, by comparison, is a volatile and unpredictable metric, shifting with the context, the audience, and the current emotional climate. This instability breeds anxiety for everyone involved. Conversely, individuals feel fundamentally safer in the presence of true authority because they know exactly where they stand. They know what to expect and that boundaries will remain firm. This sense of security is frequently mislabeled as distance, yet distance is not synonymous with disconnection. Authority can be expressed through warmth, empathy, and deep humanity. What it lacks is neediness. The craving for approval fundamentally weakens your impact because it transfers control to the other party. The instant someone perceives that you are hungry for their liking, they gain a psychological upper hand. They may not exercise this power with intent, but the relationship shifts nonetheless. You become overly cautious, while they become less invested. Authority rectifies this imbalance. When you are firmly rooted in your own self-respect, you choose to connect with others rather than chasing after them. That choice is palpable. It generates an authentic attraction rather than a forced obligation. This path does not lead to isolation but to a higher state of self-regard. When you respect yourself, the world adjusts to that standard. You no longer need to overwhelm, impress, or repeatedly explain your limits. Influence becomes both natural and enduring the moment you refuse to trade your authenticity for the fleeting comfort of being liked. In the 8th chapter, we examine how influence manifests in the practical realities of daily existence. Influence is often debated as a series of abstract concepts like charisma or presence, but in practice, it is found in the minute, ordinary exchanges, the dialogue that shifts direction, the decision that settles quietly, and the friction that dissolves without a fight. Authentic impact is functional and situational. It is earned through tangible conduct rather than mere intent. In professional settings, influence rarely resides with the most boisterous individual. Instead, it belongs to the person who remains the most composed when the pressure intensifies. When deadlines loom and the stakes are high, people instinctively seek out stability. They gravitate toward those who refuse to panic. In such moments, tranquility is transformed into leadership. When you meet stress with precision rather than frantic urgency, those around you begin to mirror your state. Meetings decelerate, discussions sharpen, and your very presence begins to regulate the collective without the need for a single order. This is the true mechanics of influence. Furthermore, influence is clearly revealed in the way we handle disagreement. Most people operate under the illusion that influence is the act of forcing others to adopt their viewpoint. In reality, the most effective sway often involves allowing a disagreement to exist without offering resistance. When you decline the impulse to correct, defend, or overwhelm, you provide others with the psychological room to reflect. People become significantly more receptive when they do not feel backed into a corner. A simple acknowledgement of their position, offered without an immediate counterargument, can effectively dismantle defensiveness. It signals respect without implying a surrender of your own values. Respect is the bedrock of all lasting persuasion. In the realm of personal bonds, influence is expressed through the quiet enforcement of boundaries. Boundaries are not aggressive demands, they are the stated conditions of your presence. When they are communicated with calm and upheld with consistency, they mold the behavior of others without the need for conflict. People adjust their actions not because they have been coerced, but because the environment they inhabit has fundamentally changed. For instance, when you refuse to participate in volatile arguments, those arguments lose their utility. When you meet provocation with neutrality, the provocation eventually withers away. Influence functions through the weight of consequence rather than the friction of confrontation. A further practical implementation of influence lies in the mastery of engagement timing. Not every circumstance demands an immediate answer, nor does every friction require an instant resolution. Individuals who attempt to manage every minor issue eventually deplete their own energy and systematically dilute their perceived authority. In contrast, those who are selective with their involvement preserve both their stamina and their overall impact. This strategic restraint is a profound expression of respect for both oneself and the gravity of the situation. When you reserve your speech for moments of genuine consequence, your contributions carry significant weight. Others pay attention because they recognize that you are not merely reacting out of impulse, but responding with deliberation. Furthermore, impact is sustained through unwavering consistency. Inconsistency breeds ambiguity, and ambiguity is the enemy of trust. When your conduct fluctuates according to your internal mood, external pressure, or the specific audience, you become unreliable in the eyes of others. This leads to hesitation and a constant testing of your boundaries. Stability simplifies every interaction, as people learn exactly what you will tolerate and calibrate their behavior to match that standard. Consequently, the need for constant explanation disappears, as your actions serve as your most effective medium of communication. Within the sphere of leadership, influence is frequently and incorrectly equated with control. However, while control may secure outward compliance, it never fosters true commitment. Authenticity in leadership aims for alignment, where individuals contribute their best efforts willingly because they possess a sense of ownership and care about the final result. Such a state cannot be coerced. Alignment flourishes only when people feel psychologically safe enough to think critically, ask questions, and contribute their unique perspectives. When the guiding authority is steady and non-reactive, the culture of fear diminishes, allowing creativity and performance to thrive. This highlights why emotional regulation is a foundational leadership competency. These principles extend directly into the art of negotiation, which is less about winning a conflict and more about the deep understanding of leverage. Leverage is rarely found in the words spoken at the table. It resides in the words withheld, in the availability of options, in patience, and in the genuine willingness to walk away. Those who scramble to finalize a deal broadcast their desperation, while those who remain composed maintain their position of strength. Utilizing silence during a negotiation is a potent strategy because it shifts the psychological burden, allowing the opposing side to disclose their sense of urgency and providing you with vital data without exposing your own vulnerabilities. In the routine of daily existence, influence is demonstrated by how you navigate instances of disrespect. An aggressive reaction merely intensifies the struggle, while passive avoidance without clarity invites the behavior to recur. A composed acknowledgement, supported by a consistent boundary, communicates strength without the need for unnecessary drama. People often probe the behavior of others to define the edges of what is permissible. How you respond in these moments serves as their primary education. True impact also involves the grace of allowing others to save face. Publicly correcting another person often leads to humiliation, which invariably breeds long-term resentment. Conversely, addressing issues with private clarity preserves the other person's dignity, making them far more receptive to adjustment because their core identity is not under attack. This is not a form of trickery but a manifestation of high social intelligence. Authentic influence respects the fundamental mechanics of human psychology, acknowledging the roles of fear, pride, and independence, and works in harmony with these forces. This exploration does not provide a toolkit for the domination of others. Rather, it illustrates how influence naturally manifests when your conduct is grounded, reliable, and purposeful. Impact is not a performance you execute, it is a state of being you embody, and in the practical world, that embodiment resonates far more powerfully than any calculated strategy. In our 9th chapter, we examine the critical boundary between ethical influence and deceptive manipulation. The distinction between the two is not found in the specific techniques employed, but in the underlying intention. On the surface, influence and manipulation can appear nearly identical, as both require a sophisticated grasp of human behavior, timing, and emotional intelligence. However, their internal trajectories are diametrically opposed. Influence honors the autonomy of the other person, whereas manipulation seeks to exploit their softest points. The manipulator is preoccupied with dictating the final outcome at any cost, prioritizing temporary compliance or personal advantage above all else. In contrast, the influential individual pursues alignment, valuing the result but never at the expense of mutual trust or human dignity. This distinction is paramount because manipulation always incurs a psychological debt. While it may yield immediate results, such as a forced agreement or temporary silence, it systematically poisons the relationship. Over time, people begin to feel utilized, even if they cannot immediately identify the cause. Suspicion takes root, and a quiet resistance begins to build. Influence, however, operates like compound interest. When individuals feel genuinely honored and safe, their receptivity increases, trust accumulates, and the need for excessive verbalization to inspire movement begins to fade. The manipulator's primary instrument is psychological pressure, whereas the genuine influencer operates through the lens of clarity. Manipulation frequently utilizes emotional shortcuts, guilt, apprehension, manufactured urgency, or empty flattery, to bypass the reflective mind and strike directly at one's insecurities. Phrases such as, "If you truly care," or "This is your final opportunity," are specifically designed to provoke an immediate reflex. While these tactics may yield results, the emotional surge eventually subsides, leaving behind a residue of resentment and regret that systematically erodes any potential for future impact. In contrast, ethical influence eschews these shortcuts. It provides the necessary time for thought, invites voluntary choice, and refuses to back an individual into a corner. This approach is far from passive. It can be firm and decisive, but it remains fundamentally transparent. When the other party understands the what and the why of an interaction, that transparency builds an enduring foundation of credibility. One of the most transparent indicators of a manipulative intent is the imposition of urgency without a valid necessity. When someone demands an instantaneous decision without a logical reason, they are often attempting to sabotage your ability to reflect. Authentic influence, however, welcomes reflection because it trusts that true alignment will withstand scrutiny. Another hallmark of deceit is inconsistency. Manipulators frequently shift their narratives to suit the convenience of the moment, even if their current words contradict their previous statements. Ethical influence relies on the opposite, a steadfast consistency that requires no reinvention. Furthermore, a person of influence respects boundaries, whereas a manipulator repeatedly probes them in a search for vulnerability. Long-term cooperation is built upon the understanding that psychological and emotional limits are not obstacles to be bypassed, but requirements for mutual respect. An influential individual does not inflame fear or shame to motivate movement. They recognize that emotional safety is the essential prerequisite for genuine trust. This balance is particularly vital within the realms of leadership, intimate bonds, and high-stakes negotiation. Authority devoid of ethics merely produces outward obedience, while ethics lacking authority results in ineffectiveness. True impact exists only where the two converge. When your influence is ethically grounded, there is no need to conceal your motives. You can articulate your reasoning with confidence, accept dissent without feeling personally threatened, and walk away from a situation without harboring bitterness. Manipulation lacks this freedom, as it is entirely dependent on concealment. A further distinction lies in the response to resistance. Manipulation views opposition as a barrier to be dismantled, while influence views it as vital data. Instead of asking, "How do I break this person's will?" the influencer asks, "What is being protected here?" Respecting resistance often serves to diminish it, whereas fighting it only causes it to harden. Ethical influence does not scramble to eliminate friction. It understands that resistance often signals unaddressed concerns, and resolving those concerns is what builds lasting alignment. Ultimately, manipulation inflicts damage upon the manipulator as well. Sustaining control through pressure or deception requires an exhausting amount of mental energy. One must constantly manage false perceptions, remember fabricated stories, and anticipate potential backlash. This creates a state of internal friction that inevitably leads to burnout. Influence, by contrast, simplifies one's existence. There is no facade to maintain, and no need to curate the emotions of others. This internal coherence fosters a profound sense of calm, which is not merely a pleasant state but a strategic advantage. People instinctively trust those who are internally aligned, sensing an authenticity that allows them to engage without the fear of being maneuvered. This perspective is not a lecture on morality, but a realization of strategic sustainability. Manipulation is inherently unstable, while ethical influence creates a self-sustaining cycle of respect and cooperation. As your comprehension of human behavior deepens, this distinction becomes increasingly paramount, as knowledge serves to amplify your original intent. The more insight you gain, the greater your responsibility becomes. True mastery is never measured by the degree of control you can impose on others, but by the amount of trust you are able to preserve. Operating with ethical influence allows you to move through the world with significant power and unshakable integrity, ensuring that you achieve your objectives without leaving a trail of psychological damage in your wake. That is the only form of influence that truly endures. In the final chapter, we examine the culmination of this journey, achieving an unshakable state of being. There eventually arrives a phase where the comprehension of human conduct is no longer a conscious application of theory, but an integrated part of your nature. You move beyond the realm of tactics and begin to navigate social spheres with a profound, quiet equilibrium that others sense immediately. This is the essence of being unshakable. It is important to clarify that this state does not imply emotional coldness or a lack of feeling. Rather, it signifies that you are no longer a captive of external stimuli. You can inhabit spaces of friction, dissent, or disapproval without your internal center being displaced. While most individuals are unsettled not by the events themselves but by the reactions of those around them, a sharp vocal shift, a cold look, or a hesitant reply, the unshakable individual has mastered the old reflexes of defensiveness and anger. You begin to notice the impulse to react, yet you decline to obey it, inhabiting the deliberate pause where true choice and inner authority reside. This internal stability fundamentally alters every social environment you occupy. People instinctively probe what they perceive as stable, testing the edges of your composure through subtle challenges to see if your foundation holds. When you remain consistently calm, the testing eventually ceases, as there is no vulnerability for them to exploit. This state is constructed upon a foundation of internal alignment. you possess absolute clarity regarding your values and your boundaries. Consequently, you no longer feel the need to broadcast your limits through verbal arguments, as they are clearly communicated through your consistent conduct. When your internal world is coherent, the external world loses its ability to threaten you. You stop viewing the behavior of others as a personal slight and realize that their actions are usually reflections of their own internal struggles. This emotional autonomy is deeply grounding, allowing you to move with deliberation, to speak with purpose rather than haste, and to listen with a presence that has no need for performance. Individuals who are unshakable serve as an anchor in chaotic environments, providing a sense of order simply by maintaining their own self-regulation. Emotional turbulence tends to lose its velocity when it encounters a wall of calm, making composure a truly contagious force. Another hallmark of this state is the profound capacity to endure discomfort. You can exist within a state of being misunderstood without rushing to provide an explanation. You can allow a silence to linger without feeling the need to fill it, and you can witness the disappointment of others without collapsing into a state of remorse. This tolerance effectively dismantles the machinery of emotional manipulation. Coercion depends entirely on your urgent need to resolve psychological tension. Once you no longer require that immediate relief, the pressure simply evaporates. The sense of urgency remains with the other party, while you remain centered. Unshakable people are not passive, they are strategic, choosing precisely when to involve themselves and when to remain distant, understanding that not every exchange requires a tidy resolution. This level of discernment serves to protect your mental energy and your long-term focus. Over time, the people in your life will calibrate their behavior to match your frequency. Discussions become more transparent, unnecessary drama fades, and expectations are clarified. You find that you no longer need to demand respect, as your unwavering consistency has already earned it. Internally, being unshakable also modifies how you experience sentiment. You still feel the natural human waves of frustration or annoyance, but you no longer build a permanent home there. You acknowledge the feeling without allowing it to define your identity, returning to your equilibrium with remarkable speed. There is no longer a need for mental rumination or the replaying of old arguments to achieve a retrospective victory. This rate of recovery is a formidable form of resilience. As this way of being takes root, influence becomes truly effortless. You are no longer attempting to lead others, yet they follow your lead because steadiness builds trust. People are naturally gravitated toward the grounded, finding it easier to speak with honesty and feeling less of a compulsion to perform or posture. In this space, human interaction finally becomes authentic. This represents the enduring, quiet authority that persists, an influence founded not on intimidation or mastery over others, but on the bedrock of reliability. Individuals understand precisely what to expect from your presence. Your responses are calculated, your principles are transparent, and your conduct remains steadfast. It is this unwavering consistency that establishes true credibility. This concluding section is not an invitation to reach an impossible state of perfection. Rather, it is about the synthesis of these ideas. The concepts you have explored are no longer isolated theories. They function as a synchronized posture toward existence and social interaction. You have learned to analyze conduct without the weight of judgment, to govern sentiment without its suppression, to sway others without the use of trickery, and to uphold limits without a hint of hostility. From this vantage point, the actions of others no longer have the power to unsettle you or dictate your internal climate. You meet people exactly as they are, without ever forfeiting the core of who you are. To become unshakable is not to withdraw from the world, but to engage with it devoid of apprehension. You no longer resist the environment, you stand firmly within it, and from that rooted presence, impact becomes an organic result, not because you pursue control, but because you have transcended the need for it. Grasping the mechanics of human behavior fundamentally alters your journey through life, not because you have gained the power to dominate others, but because you have reclaimed the power to govern yourself. This distinction is the ultimate realization. Throughout this exploration, one central truth has remained: impact is not something you project onto the world, it is something that manifests when your internal state is balanced. When you cease the habit of automatic reaction, when you abandon the pursuit of validation, And when you stop attempting to micromanage the future, a subtle yet profound transformation occurs. Others sense this shift. The nature of your interactions evolves, and resistance begins to melt away. You start to perceive behavior for what it truly is, a source of data rather than a personal insult. Once you comprehend the why behind the actions of others, confusion dissipates. You no longer view life through a personal lens, nor are you startled by emotional outbursts, defensive walls, or struggles for rank. Instead, you recognize the currents of fear, habit, and unfulfilled needs moving beneath the surface. This heightened awareness creates a necessary distance, and that distance provides absolute clarity. Clarity facilitates the power of choice, and choice facilitates influence. You have recognized that outward control is a mirage. The more aggressively you attempt to dictate the actions of others, the more friction you generate. However, by regulating your own tone, your timing, and your internal reflexes, you shape the environment without the need for force. In this way, tranquility is transformed into leadership, and presence becomes synonymous with authority. You have learned that emotional sensitivities drive the vast majority of human conduct, and that reacting in kind only serves to amplify the chaos. Conversely, observing these triggers without judgment turns turmoil into comprehension. Sensitivities cease to be threats and become signals that guide a deliberate response rather than a mindless reaction. You have discovered that silence is not a vacuum, but a strategic space where others disclose their nature, where urgency fades, and where impact can function without the weight of pressure. In a society consumed by noise, the practice of restraint is a rare and formidable power. You have learned that the analysis of behavior requires immense patience, and that recurring themes carry far more weight than isolated incidents. Judgment serves only to blind perception, while curiosity serves to sharpen it. By observing others without the impulse to label them, you gain profound insight without inciting resistance. You have identified the chasm between the search for approval and the establishment of authority. While approval seeks permission and depends on external whims, authority stands in alignment with the self and grows from a foundation of respect. One is inherently fragile, while the other is unyielding. You have seen that authentic influence in the daily world is a quiet force, expressed through boundaries held with composure, consistency maintained over time, and the grace to let others arrive at their own conclusions without coercion. Impact is at its peak when it is perceived as entirely voluntary. You have acknowledged that ethical influence is the only version that survives the test of time. While manipulation may yield a fleeting obedience, it systematically destroys trust. Ethical influence, however, honors dignity and preserves the independence of everyone involved, fostering relationships rather than depleting them. Finally, you have understood the meaning of becoming unshakable, not as a state of being immune to feeling, but as being firmly anchored within it. It is not about being distant from humanity, but about no longer being a puppet to its reactions. Unshakability is not defined by hardness, but by stability, and this stability alters every facet of your life. You cease bracing for conflict, you abandon the need for defensive walls, and you stop rehearsing justifications for your existence. You enter every dialogue grounded, observant, and purposeful. People perceive this immediately, and they respond in kind. Power struggles fade because you provide nothing for them to push against. At this stage, influence is no longer a conscious thought, it is the natural byproduct of your character. As you move forward, remember that mastery is a process, not a destination. You will still encounter emotion and you will still face challenges, but the difference lies in your recovery. You will return to your center faster, respond with more intentionality, and remain forever connected to your own internal compass. Practice these tenets quietly, not as a means to dominate your peers, but as a way to refine your own presence. Impact flourishes through consistency rather than performance, and through integrity rather than clever tactics.